where do we even begin with this? Where should we begin? Where do you want to go?
I would first, I think, love to create some context around ADHD and HSP for those of you who might be familiar with the topic or maybe know somebody who is impacted by the topic. But I think that when you say ADHD, you automatically have like a picture in your head of what that looks like, which is probably a random bee buzzing all over the place. But one of the things that I absolutely love about ADHD is how the brain is chemically wired. And so there are two different types of ADHD, which are now compiled into just the same term, ADHD instead of ADD. So the two have been combined, which is probably an ADHD thing by itself because we either forgot or we're too lazy to separate the two. But I think it's really important to know that ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is a chemical neurotransmitter disorder that affects the way that your brain processes information. So it's not necessarily that some folks can think too much like myself. So it's not that I can't pay attention. Everything gets a lot of attention at the same time. It affects the different executive functioning cores of your brain. And so if you don't have access to certain chemicals or do have access to too many chemicals, it can cause what's essentially a misfire. So when you think about being impulsive, your brain might walk you through step A, B, C, and D. My brain just goes to D, which is great because it's one of the reasons why I firmly believe that multifamily needs more ADHD is in order to be innovative, you have to be fearless. And not overthinking consequences is one of the superpowers that folks who have ADHD experience. So knowing how to leverage that is really important. And it's very individual. I think ADHD shows up differently depending on who you are. So for me, again, I'm a great strategist. I've got about 18 strands of information going at any given time. I like to call it a hard H. So that hyperactivity for me is really prevalent. My daughter, who is less hyperactive, she is your more classical, just ADD, very disorganized, has something in her hand and still can't find it. My son is definitely more like me with more hyperactivity. So I do believe that it's very individual at the same time. And then HSP, that's a term that a lot of people actually don't know, but it stands for highly sensitive person. And being a highly sensitive person does not mean that you are, sitting in the dark crying after a hard day. A lot of it is just the reaction to your senses. So maybe sense of taste, smell, hearing. For me, it's intuition, it's energy, and how you're impacted by things around you. And actually, Dr. Elaine Aron is one of the first researchers who's actually spent a lot of time on HSP. And so I'm in the middle of that book, and then we'll jump to the one for my daughter because there is a child version of HSP too.
It's interesting, all of that you mentioned as defining this by definite medical terms, and I'm no expert. I probably operate in these elements myself. I have small or young children that are in school too, and I think about even the way that we'll get a letter home and it'll say, so-and-so is passing a note or talking to the neighbor, if you've ever heard that kind of stuff before. And to me, I'm like, awesome. Like, that's what we need to do when you grow up and we want you to sell stuff. So I see a lot of these as like, yes, I'm excited that they've, kind of come into these challenges, even if it's like they're staring off into the window. And I know it seems like a problem in the school structure of, maybe a focused learning or whatever. But to me, I'm like, well, maybe he's thinking about new ideas or whatever the teacher, said. They're inspired by this new remark. And so I always wonder, like, how do we because you're training thousands of employees, like, everything that you just said, like, how does that change the way that you actually become a trainer? Like knowing these different ways that people interact in the spaces that they hold. How does that, have you changed anything in terms of how you train?
Yes. And so it was actually it was an epiphany moment that happened last year, where with both of my kids, I mean, they're going from in school learning to then this virtual environment. Even myself, it was really, I think, when COVID hit and you take away like all of the stimulus, right? Like for me, I was traveling, and I just firmly believe that multifamily is the best place in the world for someone who has ADHD, because I have a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes and eat chaos for breakfast. And so this is great. This is great for me. But when you take away all of that stimulus, right, and you're very much stripped down to, okay, I'm just here in my office and I'm doing the same thing. And while we're at a high level and we're functioning at a high level, there is still the removal from the external elements that can sometimes mask the struggles and the challenges. Because when you don't have that high urgency and you don't have that sense of almost stress, really, like thriving under stress, you are like, okay, well, now what do I do? So seeing that in myself, it was actually at that point when I decided to get a little bit of extra help. I was diagnosed twice with ADHD. The second time I took it seriously. And then it took me 6 months to figure out that this is really a part of my life and did not just happen from 9 to 5. It happens at all hours of the day. And then really understanding what that meant for me. And then looking at my kids who I'm seeing struggle. My son especially, and he's 13 now, but he is the kid who has been put at the back of the classroom every single year since I can remember, because he was such a distraction. And he would end up like on the island desk all the way in the back, because when he finished his work, he would be, making this kid laugh, or drawing or throwing stuff. And I never agreed with that. But I mean, as a parent, when you don't know any better, you're like, okay, well, we'll talk to them. And learning all of this, going through my own journey. And then towards the end of last year, I had this epiphany moment that, number one, different does not mean difficult. And I think that that's what a lot of people think. COVID, I think, has forced a lot of us to step out of our comfort zones to be able to actually ask for what we need. And whether you are learning or whether you are a leader, it is extremely important to lead and teach the way that others follow or learn, and to meet individuals where they're at. So one of the things that we're currently working on in restructuring how others learn is by identifying different ways that people can learn. So whether that is making sure that all of the colors that we're using in our own training are conducive to those who might have a problem seeing, making sure that the pace in which we are talking is acceptable to someone who might be hearing impaired, that we are doing something as simple as providing material in advance of a meeting. And that kills me. Like anytime I'm sitting through like a vendor demo presentation, like any supplier out there, please start sending information the day before to give people an opportunity to look it over and then reference it during your presentation. It is extremely distracting to have to write all of those notes. And little changes and shifts like that can make a world of difference. And I was almost upset with myself when I realized that I had not done that for our own employees. And those are things that I had just fought for and implemented in my own home. But, we all have those epiphany moments. And I think it's really important to figure out how humans are working and how leadership is working, because it's not the same as it used to be, because people are different. We all know more about each other. We all have access to different things. And when you have a specific need or ability or a challenge, I think you are almost responsible for figuring out what that looks like in another. Like, how are you supporting how others learn and feel and grow on their terms, not yours?
That's powerful. I love those takeaways. That's pretty interesting. I want to say, when I think about the Evolute World, the journey that people go on to become part of an organization, they may have stopped at a few other organizations before them. And I always use the operating system, like, you're either on Android or on iOS or Apple or Mac PC, however you want to describe it. But typically, the functions are different based off of the operating systems. And so as people set out to build, company culture and leadership culture, sometimes people are taking with them in other areas what they've learned in far before your influence. And it's almost like trying to get a Mac and a PC to do the same function. They're different keystrokes to do the same thing. And I just wonder what level of adjustment that we can make at the highest level for this new conversation we're having here, and think of it almost like it's a whole nother operating system that we just need to adjust to and think through. To be, at the end of the day, communication doesn't matter, as you know, is not what you say, it's how the other person receives it. And that's what's exciting to me. And where are we on this journey to get this out there? I know you started a podcast. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that's how I ended up bringing you on the show, is you being a leader, having the courage to go out there, direct to what you're doing, and influence somebody. And I'll tell you, my wife and I listened to it, and I mean, we were in tears on your first episode, because what you don't know about us is we had challenges in the things that we're doing with schools, and the impacts to them shifting the way that they learn from in person to online and all this stuff. And that was a heavy message. And it was obviously I reached out right away, and here we are talking. But tell me about the podcast and what your journey is there.
Yeah, so there's so many things that you just said that are very, very important to me, and I definitely want to make sure that I touch on what like this executive group of leaders can do, because I think I get really spoiled because I work for an organization that really celebrates individuality and that really celebrates inclusion, and I always feel like myself when I show up for work, and I am like fiercely organized. And I was showing a director my project tracker and was telling her just like, this is just the way that my brain needs to function, and all my spreadsheets talk to each other, but I have to have it this way because of my own struggles. And she just paused and said, thank God you have ADHD. And for someone who feels different and operates to a different owner's manual, those are wonderful things to hear. And I get really spoiled that I get to hear that from my own company every day, who just celebrates and leverages what it is that my brain can do. And so I think that that's going to be one of the things that I want to touch on as far as new leadership is concerned, is just really being authentic in your own self. I think that COVID really separated those who are managers and those who are leaders, because you can't lead by authority when you are not in a room with somebody and you've got choices, right? People know that they have choices. And so to even have this conversation on this big of a platform, knowing what my own reach is and knowing an audience, it was hard. It was hard to start talking about it. But one of the things that means so much to me is allowing others to feel like it's okay to be a human by being human. And I knew that I, of course, am not the only one, but there was so much that I learned about my own authenticity and about my own integrity and sharing my story that I felt compelled to get it out there. And honestly, I wanted to write a book, but that's not ever going to happen. I have ADHD. I'd rather talk about it. So Living with Einstein is the name of the podcast, and it's a lot of personal stuff. So the very first episode really talks about the backstory in how I really found out that I had it. Well, took it seriously that I had it. And I love the name of the podcast. And actually, my fiance is the one that gave it the name, because I had posted something on Facebook about Jackson getting his diagnosis at 13. And while ADHD is something that I am very comfortable with, still as a parent, to not only go through the process of getting a diagnosis, but then to weigh the options of medication, because it's not really a choice you can take back, is still really, really difficult. And so going through and making those decisions, which are, really, really, really paid off. I had posted how relieved I was that Jackson got to start his journey. And Brandon had made a comment, and he was like, yeah, I was almost going to write something back to that post that says, living with you guys is like living with Einstein, because all of our brains just fire at this high level. And it's not really until somebody else comes into our environment that we think anything is different, because all three of us have it. It's not just me. It is me and both of my kids. So we are talking about 18 topics all at the same time, tracking each other. And it feels a little different when someone comes into your environment that's not on that same wavelength. But that's where living with Einstein came from. And I've always been an Einstein fan. You can actually see my brain guide here in the back of my office. But Einstein has a quote that says, if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its whole life believing that it's stupid. And that one quote, I think, is where we are missing the bar in learning, in leadership, in friendship, in development, because we're not meeting people where they're at. We are sending them to training and expecting them to be the expert. We are saying one thing and expecting understanding. I think that we have a responsibility to confirm in another person what it is that we want to have been heard. I feel like we are focusing more on what we want to say instead of what we want others to hear. And having this human power in our authenticity, in our individuality, is a very rare opportunity for leaders to redefine what it is that they stand for. If you are not authentic or confident or competent, you're a distraction. People know. People know when they are following a leader who's not authentic. That's why not everybody is good at everything, right? Pick what you're good at and run with it. Not everybody can be, the inventors or the engineers, but for those of us who operate there, it's a very cool thing to be celebrated for those gifts. And leaders should be looking for ways to amplify those gifts. Like, what are you good at that nobody else is good at? Instead of, here, fit into my mold. Because there's no such thing as a mold anymore.
And so instead of developing our sort of what has been formerly called the weaknesses, it's really about building on what you're great at, building on those elements of and you're coming off a few sessions where we're talking about business technology and automations, and I'm thinking, wow, this is awesome, because this, you can step into the real magic that you can be and automate the things that require focus or follow up or whatever it may be. But so that shift to developing your strengths, is that proven to be a much more exponential progress with your leadership of self, I guess?
Absolutely. And I think that leadership of self is, I love that phrase too, because that's really what this is. In order to be successful, whether you are, managing ADHD or managing another, I like to call them abilities, because they really are strengths. They really are gifts. Whether it is you are managing those abilities or managing people or whomever, like, you have to be honest with yourself. It's one of the reasons why I am where I am today, is because I needed to be honest with myself. What am I? What am I not? How do I get good at it? And working through the fears that are associated with really stepping into a realm of maybe I'm the only one who's not good at multitasking. Well, now I need to go figure out what way of multitasking works best for me, and then also have the ability to ask for what I need. I think sometimes we get really in our own way with failing. and our fears of failing. And I know I do a lot of work around fearless failure. And that's actually the most recent podcast episode, is just kind of some foundation work around failing fearlessly. But acknowledging where we are able to grow in that fear and not self-inflict our own selves getting in our own way. And what that means is, before we go into a task and you get that gut feeling like, oh, I'm not going to do this, really understanding why and what's at stake and why it's at stake, and how much of that is a fact and how much of that is a feeling. That's something that I've done a lot of work around, is just separating the two of those. Sometimes our feelings can be facts and we act on that. And so building in ways to break some of our own habits that we know aren't being very supportive is really important. I've been very open on the podcast about my own struggles with rejection sensitivity. And ADHD or not, you would be lying if you did not think that when your email password doesn't work when you log into your computer that you got fired. Everybody thinks that. And why is that? You know, we really have that culture of, if I'm not doing enough, it's not going to be good enough. I mean, if you got A's when you were a kid, you were perfect. If you got anything less than a B minus in my house, you like ran for your life. And so we grow up in this score culture that teaches you that you need to perform at a certain level, that you need to achieve at a certain level. And not only that, but you are judged against everybody else. And even with things like how we do performance, it's so one size fits all. We really have an opportunity as leaders to create some individuality with how we move people from being willing to wanting to, and then able to. So moving that from, again, that one size fits all to individual is important. There are some very, strategic ways to do that, such as asking someone where they need support, asking someone, how do you learn best? If I need to communicate with you, what's the best way to do that? And it's so simple. How do you prefer to be given instruction? If I have something to offer you feedback on, how do you prefer that I do that? If we need to have a conversation that is higher level, how would you like to be notified? Nobody likes the email that says, hey, can we talk? Because if you struggle with rejection like I do, it's like, what? I'm getting fired. You tell yourself all of these stories, and then all of a sudden you are without your job, looking for a new place to live because your whole life is turned upside down and there's zero evidence to support it. So really identifying what you need and what others might need from you. I know it sounds so basic, but we have to go back to the basics right now. That's what's warranted. That's what's required, because we need to celebrate that we are working with humans, that our humans have choices and different needs and abilities. And how do we support that? And the payoff are people who raise their hand, are people with ideas, are people who take chances, because you're not working in an environment where if you get something wrong, you will be ridiculed for it. So like, imagine an environment where ideas get thrown out and mistakes are okay, and you can try and you can practice and you can gain experience. All of that is just to make people comfortable enough to innovate.
That's my word. You think about these trigger words, let's have a talk, or, come to the office, or let's have a word. All of these trigger this anxiousness that may be resting long before, you had an opportunity to even lead these people. And, I was curious if we're in a management role where you have leadership and then you have the whole management conversation, which is we try and fix people where there's nothing needs to be fixed, right? We just work on ourselves. We work through these things. And just so many thoughts come to my mind as we talk about these things, because as we collect people together on these teams, there's conversations that we need to have, like you said, where maybe with Jessica, I may start with the story, and then build on some bullets or some data points. But, with Sam over here, I need to start with the facts, and just get right to the bottom line. But we as leaders need to figure that out on our own by asking and discovering this. It's I love this journey that you're on. I know that you've been in our studio, you've trained, you've created courses, you've spoken, and you've done so many great things for our brands. And I've always told you, and I told Carrie this, I said, you're one of the best trainers I've ever seen, like ever. And I've been able to produce courses and online trainings for some of the highest success paid trainers in the world. And I'm going to tell you came in and just hit the marks. And I remember this specifically. And I love that you're constantly on that journey. I know people could learn from that. But we're coming up. We have a little bit of time left. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Are there things I should be asking that I'm not asking you? Because sometimes you just don't know what you don't know.
Totally.
Are there questions you think I should be asking you that I'm not?
Again, we could spend all day talking about this. But I think sometimes it's the question, like, what do I do with this information? Especially because it's not easy to be at a point where you just share this openly. Like I really did not come to terms with the fact that I was anyone who's even struggled with rejection for a long time. And I work with a counselor. I got like almost a whole team of people that help me, work and do cognitive things and really work through some of these emotions, because number one, I was at a point where I was just tired of feeling like I was holding my breath. And I don't know any change that didn't start with somebody not being tired of their own BS. And so I think that if that's you, the first thing that you can do is just to call yourself on your own stuff, because you don't gotta hide those lion eyes. Like, what it is that you have going on and things that you need to work through. And for me, it was just, I felt like I was holding my breath. So coming to terms with the things that are getting in your way and figuring out why. I self-reflect, I read books, I talk to people, I ask for feedback. Those are really important to me, because I know that when I ask for feedback, especially from my team or those closest to me, like, I have to be willing to do something with that information. And so really being selfless in that journey and making the transition to leading by example. Like, I want to win regardless of whether or not I've said anything. And that's really important too. Like, I try not to even focus on being a leader. Like, I really try to focus on being an example and let the leadership follow, because you can be a leader, not a great example. And that's really where those value clashes come into play. If you are scared of asking for what you need, really think about why you're scared of asking anyone for what it is that you need. And a lot of it is going to come down to that fear of failure. And I actually have like 3 really simple steps on how to fail at things. Like, you have ADHD. Because one of the reasons why we can innovate is because we are very impulsive, which is great because you don't have time to overthink anything. And you almost don't have that fear because you're so fired up and passionate. We constantly live in this state of capability where you don't know that it's not possible. So you hold on to the possibility and it just fires you up. That's why folks who have ADHD are such great entrepreneurs. Not only can we strategize like nobody's business, but we're so passionate and invested into the fact that we don't know that it won't happen. So we have put our faith into the fact that it could. So how to fail at things. Like, the first step in failing, like someone who has ADHD, is just to not to care. Just kidding. You a little bit have to care. But really thinking about why you're nervous is important. It's usually because you've got something to lose. And what is it that you think you have to lose? Maybe it's friends, family, your reputation. What's at stake if you do? Usually that is directly related to a value. Family, health, wellness, knowledge, competence, if something that you care about is at risk of loss, you probably won't try to do the thing that could risk losing that because it's too great of a thought. But I challenge you to always ask yourself whether or not there's any truth behind it, or are these stories that you've told yourself? And if you are risking losing something, why wouldn't you talk to the individuals and who that could affect and just clear up the fear? All we're doing when we're asking you to manage fear is to manage the unfamiliar, because we don't know what's going to happen. That's where the fear comes from. So step 2 in getting over fear is getting to know your fear. What about this can I find out? It might not be your favorite, but you will know whether or not you're willing to go into it. Like, I might be afraid to try something that I think is gross, but if I learn about it and I do it anyway, it might not be my favorite, but I won't be scared of it anymore. So getting to know your fear is just managing the unfamiliar. Same thing with that value loss. If I value competence and I'm scared to raise my hand in a room full of people because I'm afraid of how they're going to think of me and that's going to violate my competence, how do I manage that loss? So how do I internally say, what's going to happen if I do? What's going to happen if I don't? Let's take worst case scenario and let's build in a plan. Build in failure as part of a plan, because you're not bad at anything. You are just out of practice. And don't we practice to get experience to be good? Build that into the plan. Find out ways in advance to really work through the mistakes. How are you going to manage that? What are you going to do? So are you going to be the person who asks for feedback, who talks about it, who tells people in advance, hey, I'm going to try something new, so don't expect it to be perfect? There are so many things that you can do to manage loss and manage the unfamiliar. And then step 3 is the most important, and that is to remove unnecessary limits. I hear people say all the time, oh, I'm not that person. Oh, I could never do that. The word capability, by definition, means you don't know what's going to happen yet. It means you could, but you're not going to know until you actually try. So by definition, capability is inherently limitless, because we don't know what we're capable of until we actually try. So why would we put a ceiling on what should be the floor? By telling yourself you can't, you automatically take yourself out of the game. Because what if you could, right? What is that space of what if? Those are where you can leverage things or borrow a skill from someone who has ADHD and just get rid of the fear. You know, you can manage that. So those are 3 easy steps to manage fear, like someone who has ADHD.
I love it. I love it. And the thing that you hear in conversations as you interact with teams about the possibilities of what they're doing day to day in our properties is you hear these limits that we put on ourselves, even in achieving simple goals in some cases. I guess, how would you work through some of those, in more like, this is more coaching now, when you hear somebody speaking to a ceiling or a limitation that they may be placing on themselves, and you as the leader want them to achieve the biggest and best future that they want, and while that's up to them to decide, but how do you coach them through those, breaking through some of those limitations? Maybe just giving them a book, or is it one-to-one conversations? How do you work through those things with people?
Yeah, that's great. So it's really working through and talking out loud what the fears are. So let's take a very easy example. Like, let's say I am working with someone who is thinking about making a position change. So maybe they're going to go from a leasing agent to a community director. Maybe it's a community director manager to a portfolio manager to a more corporate position. And they're very nervous about it because they value competence, they value family. And if they are scared of doing that, the question is, what's at stake? It's always something important to you, or there's always something at stake that you're not you're not willing to risk losing, that's holding you back. So then the question is, what's at stake? And if someone's honest, it is, I don't want people to think that I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want people to think that I was promoted and I wasn't ready. I don't want to be so bad at this job that I let my family down and get fired. I want to make sure that when I am promoted, that I have every skill that I need to manage people, and that's not something that I'm great at. When you try something new, you're never great. You have to practice. You have to build that in. And so from there, once you've identified the fears, because we know that fears are just the unfamiliar, let's get to know these things a little bit. So, okay, you're nervous that you're not ready. Why aren't you ready? Well, I mean, I've only maybe done a budget once. Okay, well, who can you go work with to get more familiar with doing a budget? Who can you talk to when you have questions that's going to help you move through that? So it's getting to know those fears, building in the parameters, building in the safeguards in order to have that fail plan in the event that it does go wrong. And then when you're working with things like family, well, I don't want to let my family down. Well, have you talked to them? Have you said, hey, family, I'm up for a promotion, but I'm really nervous about it. What are we going to do if this doesn't work? And knowing that you have your family support and that you've talked about it and you've built a plan in, it's a lot easier to then move into that because you have gotten to know everything that you were scared of, and it's just not so scary anymore. The real kicker is working through, it's a ladder of inference. So it's how we make assumptions based on our own traditions and morals and ethics, things that we've grown up with. It's basically a path to assumption, and not a lot of fact is needed to get from point A to point B. You can completely fabricate a story, and that's what I like to call self-inflicted failure. So really focusing on what are the facts to support the fear and what are the feelings or what is the fiction that I'm saying. So if I'm working with someone who is really afraid, a lot of it is just the why, and that could be even someone who is a little bit more quiet or less apt to contribute or raise their hand. I like to be very intentional about inviting the quiet voices. Who's not speaking at the table? Because just because somebody's not saying anything doesn't mean that there's not a problem. How can I get you comfortable enough to provide your feedback? So doing some work around environment and fears in a similar way, getting to the root of the why is a great place to start.
This has been awesome. I mean, the way that you've shown up for our leaders today, I'm just so thankful and in gratitude for your ability to just articulate some of these ideas, and some of them are big, and maybe people haven't heard them for the first time hearing them. But then, secondly, just giving those very tactical things that they can do right now. I mean, even if it's just asking, well, what's behind that fear? I love that because then you can deal with and show up for those other things that they're truly concerned about. And thank you for all of that. I really appreciate it. And I know that we'll need to do more follow-up to this, but we're up at the end of our time. But are there any final thoughts you want to wish on the audience here?
Just thank you so much for your support. And I've been reached out to on LinkedIn and had people say, I have ADHD, or these are things that I, are challenged with too. And to have the support and being so vulnerable and open is really impactful. And I think that we need more vulnerable, open leaders. One of my favorite quotes is a Brene Brown quote, and it is, your story could be somebody else's survival guide. And that really resonates with me and helps me be brave and helps me share, and would just love feedback on what else people really want to know about. And I'm going to continue to share weekly on the Living with Einstein podcast. We're getting into some cool stuff. So the support is great. And be a good example. Be a good human, support that vulnerability. We all need it right now.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you. Say hello to the team. We thank you for showing up. And again, have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.